Hello, everyone, and welcome to an exclusive fireside chat with two industry leaders. I'm Pooja Bothra, Senior Content Lead from EDHR World. This fireside chat is a part of a thought leadership series on mapping the business impact of learning. And I'm delighted to introduce the two speakers for this fireside chat. Today with us, we have Seema Padman, Senior VP HR Epsilon. Seema leads the people function at Epsilon for India and APAC. Together with the team and the leaders, she's working to create a vibrant workplace by putting people at the center of all she does. Her career in HR spans over 17 years, and it's over different industries. And in the last 10, she's held regional and global HR leadership roles. Welcome to this fireside chat, Seema.
Thank you.
We also have Dallas Krishnan, MD for Coursera Enterprise, India and Australia and New Zealand. Dallas believes in enabling enterprises and universities to learn without limits to the Coursera platform. In his view, the power of lifelong learning and upskilling is critical to digital transformation of companies. Dallas is an experienced P&L business owner in all things cloud and digital. Welcome to this fireside chat, Dallas. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Same here, Pooja. Good to meet you once more.
My first question is for you, Seema. Modern day marketers have to figure out the perfect blend of creativity and technology and back it with data. Due to inadequate resources offline, a marketing mix in India today or in the rest of the world is incomplete without social media. We all know there is a huge disruption in the marketing industry. So my question to you is, prioritizing skill development in the digital workplace is essential and challenging at the same time. How do you manage this in your organization, and what initiatives are you taking to build a learning first culture?
Thank you, Pooja. Skill development has always been critical. I think there's no era that has where skill development has not been at the forefront, and the needs have changed over the years. But essentially, at Epsilon, we believe the culture of learning is really important to our success, and it's one of the key pillars. Learning is one of the key pillars on which our culture is built. And so we have various initiatives that enable our employees develop themselves and build skills that are relevant for them to perform in the job that they do currently, and also for them to prepare for future career growth that they aspire for. We have a host of learning events and learning mechanisms and modes that we deploy. Of course, before we all went into hybrid, there were a lot of face-to-face learning programs and learning initiatives, both which aimed at technical skills development, functional skills, and also soft skills and leadership skills. We also had virtual options at that time as well. But with moving into the hybrid kind of work environment, it has meant, or hybrid or fully remote at this point of time, it has meant that we have had a lot more focus on online and virtual learning initiatives rather than instructor-led programs. And that's been a bit of a shift that we've had. And so a plethora of things. We have learning pathways that are designed for various technical and functional roles, which kind of gives indications for people as to what learning interventions that they need to avail while following that particular pathway. We have access to a lot of content, both from Epsilon, and we've been acquired by Publicis a couple of years back, and Publicis has a plethora of learning content that our employees can avail. Additionally, we drive sessions, and I'll talk about the last 12 months and 12 to 18 months since we've gone. We've done virtual summit. This year, we did a summit, our first analytics summit virtually, which is called Innovation, which had about 1,000 employees sign up and 22 speakers, both external and internal, who came in, and industry experts who talked about the importance of marketing driven by outcomes driven by rich data. So that was one. We also have an annual summit called Develop You, This has been there right from the beginning. It's a 2-day annual learning event. And there's a plethora of learning events, learning sessions that are done, which is a mix of technical, functional, soft skills, and leadership development. And this is again by both subject matter experts, internal, external, and global, where we have access to. This is also moved virtual, and we did our event fairly recently for this year, which had about 1,200 attendees. We have, I think one of the big ways how you can drive a learning culture is when leaders kind of act in that mode, right? Asking people to learn, a culture is not set by speaking. A culture is set by role modeling certain behaviors, and that's what our leaders do. Wherever we have opportunities, we get our leaders to teach back and facilitate some of the sessions as well. And that's really helped drive home the point about how important learning is. We have learning assistance programs, which people can avail. It's a certain budget allocated for an individual every year, which they can use to learn something that is relevant to their skills building and development, and is in line with the organizational priorities as well. So all of these, I think, drive home the point that learning is really critical to your success at Epsilon. And we also ask people, one of our values is around accountability. We also ask people to take ownership of their own development. How can you stay relevant is a question that you need to ask yourself, is something we constantly say. So that's the bit about Epsilon and what we do here.
Seema, this is so interesting. And, this looks like a huge bouquet of multiple flowers. And I believe learning is like that. When you talk about summit, you talk about, external stakeholders helping your teams to learn and, learning paths. It's really elaborate and comprehensive. Dallas, the world we are experiencing today demands behavioral skills as much as technical ones. Employers more often have concerns about gaps in so-called soft skills. How do you see the future of skills evolving?
Sure, thank you. So I think first and foremost, I guess time immemorial, we've always spoken about skills in the context of functional skills, whether it is, depending if you're in the tech space, you would always talk about tech skills. And then, of course, there is all the other softer skills, be it communication, interpersonal skills, etc. So I think in the context of how we have always looked at skills, most companies, most organizations have looked at both the dimensions in many ways, right? But if we were to just look forward a little ahead, and we did this survey with the World Economic Forum, and there was a beautiful report that came out last year, sometime in October 2020. The WEF report talks about skilling in the context of two things that come together, right? And it talks about digital and human skills. In the context of human skills, of course, we have all these softer aspects of self-management, and problem solving. Those are other aspects that gain currency in that aspect. But that apart, one of the other things that we've started seeing is, for example, let's say at Epsilon, which typically impacts customers' marketing outcomes, right, in many, many ways. So one of the core skills for a marketer would be, to Seema's point, to be data driven, right, in the context of how you make the marketing a lot more impactful. So to that individual, in addition to his core functional skills around marketing, you are starting to add other skills which enable their ability to, problem solve. For example, a data skill would become an add-on skill in that scenario. So I will call that a soft skill for that person. It's not necessarily a functional skill, but it's a soft skill that they are needing to evolve so that their decision making improves, right? So we are starting to see this merger of human and digital skills coming in which impact behavioral outcomes, which impact the final impact at work, right, in the functional way. One of the other things that last year, which was a very interesting period, if we look at our platform, given we today have about 87 million learners, and if we looked at the top 10 skills in 2019, this is the pre-pandemic period, what learners were doing on our platform was, in 2019, our topmost programming, Python programming was our biggest, most in-demand skill that learners were coming and doing. Fast forward 2020, which is at the end of 2020, when the pandemic hit, the top two skills, right, were actually writing and strategy, right? And then of course we had Python programming, and then we had even more important ones: mindfulness, meditation, gratitude, kindness, listening, and learning. These were the rest of the skills in the top 10 skills. So you can imagine how the paradigm shifted with the context of time, right? So what this also does is when you have a platform of this nature, to what Seema said, finally you want the learner to explore where the situation that they are in. They know their context. Some of the context could be job driven, and hence pivot towards a job driven skill. And some of them could be personal development because of the personal situation that they're in, right? You give the platform for them to explore the behavioral side of it or a personal skill out of it. So interesting perspectives that we are seeing around this.
Very interesting, Dallas, and very, very beautifully put. I really like the way you explained that, as a data scientist, you need your core technical skills and you'll do those programs. But beyond that, what are the softer skills you need? It could be mindfulness, meditation, gratitude, empathy. And I think all these are important. Very nicely put. Seema, how do you bridge the gap between what the learner wants and what the organization wants? How does that become more challenging due to a hybrid workplace?
I have a slight difference of opinion here because there's in the question, there's an inbuilt assumption that there is a gap. And I not necessarily, right? And that's what I would come from. At Epsilon, we believe that we have an adult-to-adult relationship with our employees. And so it's very unlikely to be a mismatch or a gap between what the learner wants, because they're very, very well aware where the company is going, what direction it is. And people are, mature about how they want to align with the growth of the company and achieve that. It's very, very unnatural for us to see unreasonable expectations around learning. And there might be a small percentage, but a large part of people know what they have to learn and what they have to achieve. Right. So I don't think that there necessarily is a gap per se. But I think where for us in Epsilon, the priority is to make sure that we make learning relevant to the individual. Right. And that's when learning is most successful. Because if it's not relevant to the individual, then the take-up is not there. And success of learning initiatives, and when you've learned, is when you believe that you needed to develop yourself. You need to and so mechanisms or approaches that enable that, which is through feedback, getting the person to see and articulate, getting the person to reflect on what they need to do and drive it themselves is a big part of it. In terms of skills per se, and it was interesting, and I think Dallas mentioned it in terms of the top skills that were being kind of chosen by people. What struck me during what Dallas was sharing was that some of the skills that he mentioned are what we call meta skills, right? They are not necessarily. So I'll take the example. You talked about empathy, and if you develop empathy, you can apply that across a range of situations, and that's what a meta skill is. And so if an organization can develop a meta skill, which is around aspire for learning itself, the aspiration to learn and develop, and that's why the learning culture becomes important, then you don't necessarily have a gap, or you don't necessarily need to drive that. And so it's very easy, and that's the most difficult thing, not per se building skills in the technical or functional area, but building those meta skills so that the individual kind of drives it themselves. And so the top meta skills that are in line with what Dallas was saying is what we're seeing is creativity is one that's coming up. Resilience is coming up, and self-awareness is coming up, and all of that contribute to making sure that we can kind of align the learning needs of the organization and the individual, because self-awareness naturally kind of helps with that. It's the mechanics that you have in place to kind of make sure, they are aligned. One thing that hybrid has made difficult is opportunities to learn, right? And if you look at new employees who come into the organization, and a lot of our learning is context driven. We learn from observing other people, especially new grads who come into the organization, new employees. They pick up the nuances and they kind of learn from observing and seeing how somebody is reacting to a situation or responding to a situation. They learn from, diverse perspectives. All of those opportunities have been missed out, and that I think is the bigger struggle with hybrid, rather than a perceived or a gap per se, which I don't see.
Very interesting, Seema. And in a way, it puts the same perspective as what Dulles started with. That today an organization is not only about, skills those directly impact your work. It's about those other skills also. So I guess whatever the learner wants to learn, the organization would also want the same for the learner. Dulles, the question for you is, how does Coursera as a platform work towards understanding and satisfying the need of an individual along with the organization?
Which actually, Seema answered my question. She actually talked about learning being relevant to an individual, right? So if you really think about it, so that's essentially what we have done on our platform. So when we think of, so there are, one is, Coursera as a platform, we have this great credentials, university authored content, and from the topmost universities and stuff like that. That's one part of it. So that's the content engine part. But what we leverage the platform as a result of the learners being on us and the industries and companies being on us is that we have this visibility into where the skills are and where the new skills are emerging. So that's at a very high level. What we have done in the platform now, especially for corporate customers, is we have translated these into what we call as skill sets, right? I'm sure Seema will be fairly aware of that terminology. Now, skill sets are essentially role driven. So what we typically do is when we work with companies, we go to a company, map the organization, map the roles, and define the key capabilities underneath it. And underneath capabilities, we have various skill sets that drive that overall capability, right? That decision-making capability, data, technology, right? Functional. You could take any dimension to it, and then you define the underlying skill sets. Now, then comes the proficiency element, right? Which is depending on the role and the level of, depending on a role that sits in there, you might want to define proficiency, right? So for example, let's say in my sales organization, the person with an SDR, who's a sales development and who does outbound, inbound calls, I may want to have more skills and proficiency in terms of his ability to communicate, articulate the value proposition. At the same time, negotiation, while it's a core skill for a salesperson, it may not be a proficiency that I might want to look at for an SDR to be as a critical. So what we have done is, when I as an individual learner log into the platform, I can actually see for my role, here is the proficient skill sets that I need to be, and here is the proficiency level I need to be at, right? So as an individual, I can actually say, here are the areas that I'm behind, here are the areas that I am ahead. And for the areas that I am behind, what the platform does is it curates the content and tells them, okay, here is the content that you can do based on which your proficiency can go from level X to level Y. And as the learner moves through that content, it is not about completion of a course. It's not completion of number of hours. It's about what he has learned that determines, right? Sometimes it could be where I could have just done 20% of the course, and it might meet the proficiency level for my skill, and will tell you that, oh, you hit the proficiency level because you reached that proficiency requirement. At the same time, I can, as an individual, say, what, I could complete this entire course, which is a 15-hour course, and then get to the next level. Or I could take a set of specialization, which is a set of 15 courses that makes a specialization and takes me from an intermediate, beginner, or conversant level all the way to an expert category. And I could be personally motivated to do that. So we talk about this framework in the context of a learner of I can to I want, right? You want to get the learner to get to a point where he is motivated and say, I want to get from level X to level Y. A platform allows for that transparency. It's not just about completing a course, getting a certificate, but it also allows him to then see where his proficiency is and where he wants to go. So as a, then in the context of the organization, you actually can see which are the learners who are putting in that extra effort to go beyond, which are the learners who are just about meeting the levels, right? Which leaders are picking up the right next level skills, which will take them to the next role. So that's a huge amount of data that then can be leveraged by the organization. It then becomes a wonderful flywheel, right? People will be motivated because they know that this data is the real data that is used. I, as an individual, know where I am and what I need to do. And the platform provides the curated, content. So some of which could be from us, some of which could be employer authored content, SME authored content from the companies and corporates that goes into that same platform, and it becomes leveraged in order to improve your skills. So that's the way we are seeing this work. And it's been fairly good examples of ROI from some of our top customers as well.
Thanks, Dallas. And that gives me the cue for my next question. Of course, data is very important. Learning programs do generate, mindful of data. So Seema, what metrics do you follow in your organization to assess the success of your learning strategies? And is there anything you follow, to improve on an ongoing basis?
From time immemorial, I think the Kirkpatrick 4 levels of measurement has been used by HR professionals world over. I haven't seen anything vastly different from that. And so we typically use that. There's the first level where feedback after a session. There's a second level is their application, is there behavioral change, and is there a shift in the performance. So all of those are kind of in different ways. It doesn't work the same way for everything. Some of the courses that Dallas mentioned, the skills building course, which is coding skills or Python, all of that are very easily measurable, right? Because you apply it in your day-to-day job. But the harder ones are, those are the more interesting ones, I would say, and it kind of brings you that adage saying, what can be measured does not matter, and what does matter you may not be able to measure it, right? So there's that proverb. So the technical skills are really easy to measure. It's the other ones that kind of get difficult. I personally believe that some of the other programs, that first level of feedback, which a lot of learning L&D professionals rely on, look at the feedback form and say we've got this high score. Sometimes a learner goes into a session, and if his or her beliefs and thoughts are validated by the person who's running the session, the facilitator or the instructor, there tends to be a higher, response, a higher appreciation for such courses. Whereas if there's a trainer or facilitator who's challenged your thinking, sometimes that initial reaction, because you've been taken aback by what the perspective has been, and it's fairly different from yours, has caused some bit of, it's been unsettling, and so the rating tends to go down. So I find that also, there are nuances to that, and also to kind of equate increase in performance or the ROI, what somebody says, to just one learning event is really hard. You can't kind of really give that very clear impact in that manner, because there's a host of factors that go into really embedding learning through a program. And I also think that one of the challenges in organizations is that most L&D professionals will talk about the 70-20-10 model, right? That's always talked about. But what is typically measured is at 10%, right? And you say, well, the L&D function can impact the 10%, and 70% of learning happens on the job, 20% through coaching from your manager and other mentors, and 10% through training. A lot of the focus is measuring that 10%. And the question is that really effective, right? So 70% of your learning is on the job, then shouldn't you be measuring what that percentage is? So I feel, again, that argument is a little flawed, but we try and do whatever possible to kind of make sure we have the right mechanics in place to make sure learning is embedded. And that includes making sure that the leader is engaged in the learning initiative. And some of our programs involves them getting engaged very early on, even in terms of articulating what the content needs to be to develop their people. Sometimes they are co-facilitators. So, when the leader is kind of emphasizing learning, then it becomes critical. And so the person has to come back and really apply the learning at their job, that they have apply the learning that they have gained. So those are soft nudges that really create that learning culture and learning environment, which results in a bigger impact of learning. So the role the manager or leader plays is immense in this as well. So along with that, we do the other soft pieces as well, is what I'd like to say.
Thank you, Seema. And we've really run out of time, but we'll just have one last question for Dallas. Dallas, how are organizations looking at building ROI from their learning investments?
So Pooja, I think I'll give a two-dimensional answer to this, right? One is a learning framework driven, where we speak about this open learning, guided learning, and skill sets driven learning. So the open learning typically, and organizations have a mix of all these, right? Depending on the cohort of learners that they have. Typical open learning, you would see number of hours individuals have trained themselves on. Guided learning is where you're trying to, and the first one typically happens more in the employee benefit type of discussions that you're trying to give, right? Where the learning assistance programs, et cetera, are provided. And then there is a platform that allows them to, use that investment. And you can essentially start measuring, at least at a very simplistic level, in terms of learning hours, right? But that's a very basic level, more at a mass digital literacy or learning literacy, learning quotient measurement, right? The second one, more guided one, which is typically driven around some immediate impact that companies are trying to make. And around that, for example, a company is wanting to move into more data-driven decision-making, so hence data literacy is an immediate impact. So you curate a program and then you start measuring course completion, right? How many people have completed, right? And then there is, through the LMS, you would send out reminders to ensure that there are as many number of people who have completed the courses, got a certain number of certifications, right? So that's the more guided learning framework. The third one is more, which we discussed a little earlier, which is the more learner-driven, skill sets-driven, role-driven, which is more typically linked more to business outcomes, right? With the capability that we have increased, are we impacting revenue? Are we impacting our ability to take more projects, right? Are we impacting our strategic goals around digital transformation? So those tend to be more business driven. Most organizations we've seen have a mix of these, but the ones which have gone through the journey where digital learning is fairly embedded tend to move more and more towards the skills driven learning frameworks. So that's one dimension. We actually did a study with IDC, with one of our customers, to just see how was it that they adopted our platform and what were they looking at. So they measured the impact with that particular client around 4 dimensions. One was around delivering on the strategic goals of digital transformation. That was a core driver for that organization. The second one that IDC measured was around realizing the value of the technology investments and implementation, because they were deep into taking in technology. They wanted to figure out how the adoption has improved as a result of some of the enablement that have gone through. The third one, which is more moving away from the technology part, was around improving the employee retention and engagement. So they saw a direct correlation between that. And the fourth, of course, was reducing the overall talent acquisition costs, because this becomes a talent pipeline in the context of how are you creating a next cohort set from within the organization. You can always buy, but built is always seen as more efficient in the context of skills and talent. And that has a direct correlation to the employee retention. So there's some interesting statistics that we came. This is a published study. Overall, the ROI was a massive, right? Mind-boggling one. 746% ROI in the 3-year ROI that customer looked at. There were, in terms of simple impact, it was something like 94% of the employees got trained through that platform. On the employee retention and professional development benefits, they saw something like about 38% reduction in employee attrition, right? Some close to $1 million reduction in recruitment costs because there was a lot more internal recruitment that happened. And there was a 20% increased likelihood of an internal mobility for employees, which from a retention perspective becomes an important element. Then there were other, as I said, there was a business productivity impact that was measured for the customer, but there was a clear outcome in the context of productivity of that learner, pre-learning to the post-learning, had close to about 30% additional impact. It was like a $20,000 additional revenue impact of that individual pre and post-learning in the context of the business. So just an example of how that dimension was brought into fruition with one of our customers.
Thank you, Dallas, for sharing that. We've had very interesting conversation. I learned so much from both of you, and I'm sure all the budding, HR and L&D leaders would also really, find this very, very insightful. So thank you, Dallas. Thank you, Seema, for joining in today for this fireside chat.
Thank you.
Thank you.